Today we want to study the Rambam Shita with regard to Lulav Shel Asherah, and perhaps we'll even get to a discussion about Lulav Shel Ira Hanidachas. The Rambam writes in Perek Ches Halacha Aleph of Hilchas Lulav, our boss minim ha'elu shem Lulav Vadas V'Arav V'Yesrog Shahaya Echad Mehem Yovesh O Gozul O Gonuv Afilu Liachar Yeush. The Rambam emphasizes that in the case of Gozul or Gonuv, it's after Yeush, which means that even if I were to hold that Yesh B'chti Kani, which means that there's no Chison of Lachem, he owns the Esrog. Paradoxically, a Ganav acquires ownership over the stolen goods, in this case the Lulav. But nevertheless, the Rambam says even after Yeush, and even after he was Konet, it's still possible, and that can only be based on Mitzvah Bob Avera, as we discussed yesterday. O Shahoya Me'Ashera Nevedes. So we're talking about an Asherah, and the Rambam classifies Asherah together with Gozul Ugonuv. Again, he opens with Yovesh, which is a different kind of a psul entirely. But then he goes on to Gonuv or Gozul, Afilu Liachar Yeush, which is Mitzvah Bob Avera, and then immediately he codifies Asherah. We're not sure if Asherah is a separate category in a different Sibat HaPsul, a different reason, or it's a hemshech of that which came right before it, and therefore would come under Mitzvah Bob Avera. But the problem is going to be, as we'll soon see, that the Gemara says explicitly that the reason why Lulav Shel Asherah is disqualified is for an entirely different reason, which is called Kintusei Mechta Shi'ura. But the Gemara doesn't invoke the principle of Mitzvah Bob Avera. So we'll have to go very slowly here if we want to insist that the Rambam, again, we don't have any proof for this, but if we theoretically want to insist that the Rambam's Asherah is to be grouped together, swallowed together with Gonuv or Gozul, and therefore we're going to apply the psul of Mitzvah Bob Avera, then in addition to the obvious problem of how this is or why this is Mitzvah Bob Avera, Tosafos says that Asherah is not Mitzvah Bob Avera because it's not that the mitzvah is Ba Machmas Avera. I mean, even had he not worshipped this Asherah, he still could have used the lulav for the mitzvah. It's not like Zela, where he had no other lulav that was accessible to him. But even if we solve that problem, and we can justify why in the Rambam's frame of reference, Mitzvah Bob Avera would apply to Asherah, we still have another problem because the Gemara applies a different principle, namely Kintusei Mechta Shi'ura. However, we're going to now read the next few words in this Rambam and prove conclusively that the Rambam is not operating with Kintusei Mechta Shi'ura. Why? Because the Rambam writes, Afal Pisha Bitlo Asherah Bila Ovdo, etc. Let's stop there. Okay. The Gemara tells us that there's a difference between what's called Asherah de Moshe. Asherah de Moshe is a phrase that refers to those trees in Eretz Yisrael that were worshipped at the time of Kibush Eretz Yisrael, which means that this is called the Avodah Zarah Shel Yisrael. So again, when it says Asherah de Moshe, you have to, in your mind, you have to rewrite the text and substitute Asherah Shel Yisrael. Moshe here means Yisrael. Now, the law of Avodah Zarah Shel Yisrael is that there's no bittul. What is bittul? Again, the classic case of bittul would be when someone has an idol and he declares this idol is no longer is not a deity. It could be that bittul requires that he even physically chops off a piece of the idol. But bittul only applies to avodah zarah shel akum, shel goy. If it's avodah zarah shel Yisrael, there is no bittul. So when the Mishnah passes a lulav shel Asherah, it stipulates that it's Asherah de Moshe, which means Asherah de Yisrael, which means that there's no bittul, and therefore we can activate and apply the principle of Kitusei Mechta Shiura because there's no bittul. Once bittul is a possibility, then there's no Kitusei Mechta Shiura. Kitusei Mechta Shiura, by definition, means that the object will definitely be destroyed because the legal requirement is to destroy the object. But if you have an object that lends itself to bittul, and kolshkein, if there was bittul and the bittul was effective, then it's no longer Kitusei Mechta Shiura. And the Rambam says, Afal Pisha Bitlo. Not only that, the Rambam doesn't qualify this Asherah as Asherah de Moshe. So the Rambam seems to be expanding the psul of Asherah, which was worshipped as an idol, to include even an Asherah of a god without any Jewish possession over the Asherah. And that's why it lends itself to bittul, because avodah zarah shel goy, shel nachri, is nital bittul. He went ahead, he was mevatel. Now, after the bittul, he wants to take that lulav from the Asherah and use it for the mitzvah. And the Rambam says it's possible. Why? There's no Kitusei Mechta Shiura after bittul. And not only that, the Rambam doesn't even seem to be referring to an Asherah de Moshe where there is no bittul. So if the Rambam is not operating with Kitusei Mechta Shiura, then l'chora, by process of elimination, he must be operating with a psul of mitzvah baba avera, dumya de gazel ogana. Oshahaya shel irani dachas hareza apostle. So he's got a lulav of an irani dachas. And once again, we're not sure why the Rambam would exclude a lulav shel irani dachas. One way is to say because of Kitusei Mechta Shiura. The halacha is that irani dachas requires sreifa. You have to burn everything down. And therefore, we apply the principle of Kitusei Mechta Shiura. Okay. Now we start with this kash on the Rambam. Let's start with the Maggid Mishnah, and then we go over to the Kesef Mishnah. The Kesef Mishnah basically reiterates the question of the Maggid Mishnah. Maggid Mishnah was much earlier than the Kesef Mishnah, but he refuses to accept the answer of the Maggid Mishnah to this kasha, meaning the interpretation of the Rambam. What was the kasha? By Gemara Amru, the Gemara tells us, okay, we'll have to find this Gemara. I believe it's on Lamed Aleph. We'll see it B'li inside. V'shal Asherah Pasal Rak. Instead of Rak, I would write Dafka. V'Asherah de Moshe. Why? Because Asherah de Moshe means Asherah Shel Yisrael. Asherah Shel Yisrael doesn't lend itself to bittul. And therefore, we apply the principle of Kitusei Mechta Shiura, because it definitely has to be destroyed. The Kitusei Mechta Shiura. So that's in the Gemara itself. You know what? Let's take a minute and see the Gemara inside. I think that's, from a perspective of scholarship, that's what we should be doing. Well, let's see if I'm right, and it's on Lamed Aleph. I'm not 100% sure. If you see it before I do, please let me know. Oh, here it is. Lamed Aleph Amid Beis. And it's 4.5 lines up from the bottom. If you're going from the bottom of Lamed Aleph Amid Beis up, you count 5 lines. And the Gemara says as follows. So first the Gemara quotes the Mishnah, Shal Asher Shal Irani Dachas, both are possible. And the Gemara asks the following: the Shal Asher apostle, Va'omar Rav Lulav Shal Avodah Zarah Lo Yitol V'Yimnot Al Kosher. So our Mishnah establishes that a lulav shal asher is possible, completely possible even with the Eved. Whereas Rava says lulav shal avodah zarah, again he doesn't mention asherah but shal avodah zarah, and asherah for sure is avodah zarah, is imnot al kosher, but the Eved is yotze. So how do we reconcile the Mishnah with Rava? So the Gemara answers, Hacha ba'asherah de Moshe askinon, the kituse mechte shiuri. So I'm going to read to you the commentary of the Masechet. He writes, "Ba'asher de Moshe medubar be'asher shal Yisrael." Again, Moshe means Yisrael. Right? The simul is Hareach Mekudeshesli Kedas Moshe v'Yisrael. Moshe meaning Yisrael. Ke'ein osan ashero shahoy b'mei Moshe Rabbeinu shetzivsa aleim haTorah l'sarfan. So he quotes here the pasuk in Dvarim Yud Beis Vashreim Tisrufum Ba'esh. So all the Asheros that were worshipped, and Yoshua comes in to conquer the land, all those require streifa. They have to be burnt. Shebizman Moshe Rabbeinu, the Esha Ovru Sha'ovdu Yisrael Sa'egel, this avu laharbos laharbe elohus, u'shum kach nechshevu kol hasheru shenevdu al yidei hagoyim be'eretzo ki'ilu nevdu b'shlichusam shel Yisrael ve'nechshavus hasheru shel Yisrael. All right, this is very complicated. We'd have to know a lot more about Avodah Zarah to understand this. But the end of this mechanics, this very complex, abstract mechanics, is that all the Asheros at the time of Yoshua coming into the land have a din of Asheros Shel Yisrael. It has something to do with Chet HaEgel and Shlichus and so on, but whatever it is, so any Asher at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, meaning Moshe Rabbeinu was the generation of entering into Eretz Yisrael, he himself didn't enter, but at that point, all the Asheros were considered like Asheros Sha'avdu Yisrael. They didn't actually worship these Asheros, but it's as if the avoda of the Egel now spreads its wings and encompasses all the Asheros in Eretz Yisrael. And in those cases, a lulav from any one of those Asherah trees would be possible even b'di'evet because of kitutei mechse shi'ura. We'll get to Rav in a second. So what's kitutei mechse shi'ura? You remember that Moshe Rabbeinu took the Egel and he completely chopped it up until it was totally disintegrated. And that's the deal with an Asherah Shel Yisrael, meaning as if the same worship, the same act of worship of the Egel took place with regard to all the Asherahs. Again, that's very complicated. I don't want to lose you on that. You just have to accept that right now as axiomatic. Any Asherah that existed at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, which means at the time that Yoshua crossed the Jordan into Israel, those have the status of Asherah Shel Yisrael. Even though I know that you're objecting because it was actually worshipped by one of the 7 nations that occupied the land, but halachically, it has the status of Asherah Shel Yisrael. And that means that Kituse Mechta Shira kicks in. And what is Kituse Mechta Shira? Just like Moshe Rabbeinu destroyed the Egel, so too we have to destroy all the Asheros. And there's no way of salvaging them. Do you follow what I mean? They have to be burnt under all circumstances. There's no ifs, ands, and buts, no conditions. It's absolute. Now we get to Rav. Ulam Rav medaber b'lulav shel avodah zarah shel yigai. So when Rav speaks about lulav shel avodah zarah im not al kosher, again, l'chadchila we don't want to get involved in it, but we're talking about an avodah zarah of a guy, meaning we're not talking about an extension of the egel. We've passed that period of time of Yoshua entering into the land. And down the line in history, when a guy worships, in this case, a tree, which is part of the paganistic culture to worship trees, then the lulav of such a tree, b'di'evet at least, is kosher. Why? He says the following: Efshal levatla, ume'achar shenitan levatla lahatis alulav ba'nov v'lo yisarev, lo shayach bo ki tusei mechtes shiur. So what's the Efshal levatla? He says, based on a sugya avodah zarah, goy mevatel avodah zarah shalo, klomer osa bo maisa. Like I said before, he chips off a piece. Hamochiach she'eno noig bo ba'od elohus. Akagon shekota es rosh ozno. He cut off the top of the ear of the idol. Oglosh chotma, or the front part of its nose. Is there Maisa Mochia She'eno Noig Ba'od Elohus? Harei B'Tela Midin Avodah Zarah Muteres Ba'no. So you can completely vitiate or undermine the status of Avodah Zarah, bring it back to its original status before it was worshipped through the mechanism of bittul. So Rav is talking about a case of a lulav shel avodah zarah shel goy, which lends itself to bittul, and therefore we cannot apply the principle of kitus emechta shiura, because who knows whether it'll be mavatal it, and if he'll do this act of bittul and cut off its nose, then there's no din of streifa. Okay, I see there's an arichus here in the footnote. I don't know when we'll have time to do this, but I want to get back to this this essay. Let me just see if I could. Okay. So now we get back to the kasha of the Maggid Mishnah. The Rambam, when he disqualifies a lulav shel Asherah, he doesn't qualify that we're talking about an Asherah de Yisrael. And on the contrary, the Rambam says explicitly, Afal Pisha Bitlo, that he was Mavatal the Asherah, which by definition could only apply to an Avodah Zarah shel Goy, because there's no bittul with regard to an Avodah Zarah shel Yisrael. Upirshu Amafarshim, we're on the top now, page Chaf Zayin, if you're following the text. Da Kavana, what does the Gemara mean when it differentiates between Asherah de Moshe as opposed to Rav's case of an Asherah de Avodah Zarah? Asherah de Moshe is an Asherah shel Yisrael. The Bisman Moshe Hoisa Kol Eretz Yisrael shel Yisrael, whatever that means. Vasheros Shahayu Sham Mikri Asherah shel Yisrael. It's a whole different shot than what we saw before, namely that the Goyim who were worshiping the Asheros in Eretz Yisrael were just shluchim that were appointed by the Ovdei HaEgel. He's not connecting into the Egel. He's just saying that Eretz Yisrael belonged to Klal Yisrael. I don't know exactly how we know such a thing, but the ownership of Klal Yisrael over the entire land of Israel means that any Asherah that was worshipped is considered Asherah Shel Yisrael, She'ein Lem Bittul. And that's why it's possible, because the principle of Kitusim Echtashira kicks in. You've got to burn it. You have no other option. It's like Moshe destroyed the Egel. Avol Asherah Shel Akum, if the Asherah was owned by the guy, Sheyesh La Bittul, Lo Amrinan Kitusim Echtashira Ksher Lulav, but the Rambam doesn't make that qualification. So if all that is the Pol Ayotze from the Gemara, but the Rambam writes that Afal Pisha Bitlu as Asher Mila Ovdo, Harei Ze Posel. Harei Asher Shal Akum Shebitluha, Mevua B'Gemara, De Kosher, right? But the evidence kosher, Mishum the law Amrina Beik to say Meftashiyur. So there's an unbelievable steer here between the Sugya and the Rambam. It's like a head-on collision. I'm tempted to mention, but Dokri Tishkat, the Rambam writes in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah that you could go from Torah Shebetzav straight to his Mishnah Torah and just skip over all of Shas. I mean, he got a lot of flack for that, for saying that. But if you skip Shas, you're okay. No, the Rambam's just telling you that an Asherah tree that was worshipped as an idol, its lulav is possible, period. But we're not going to do that. We're not going to skip over Torah Shebal Peh over the Shas. And in the Shas, we come to the exact opposite conclusion. That the only reason why this lulav of an Asherah is possible is because it doesn't lend itself to bittul, because it's an Asherah de Moshe, which means it's owned, in quotation marks, by Klal Yisrael. And in Avodah Zarah, the possession of Klal Yisrael has to be burnt. There's no way of doing any bittul, any magic of bittul. And the Rambam says, even after bittul, it's still possible. So in order to salvage the Rambam, the Maggid Mishnah comes up with some obscure, unknown girsa, a different text in the Shas than the one that we have in our Gemaras. Da'atam da'asher apostle who mishum mitzvah bo ba'aver. The Hersta Maisa. Did you ever hear such a story? There's a line in the Gemara that got left out. And instead of saying Kituse Mechta Shiura with regard to Lulav Shal Shira, it says Mishum Mitzvah Bo Ba'aver. Now there's a double chutzpah here on the part of the Maggid Mishnah. On the one hand, it's a chutzpah to come up with a girsa that's unknown. And secondly, it's a chutzpah noira to say that the Rambam had this unknown text of the Gemara. But we'll see that we can answer both of these objections. We're going to prove that the Rambam had a different girsa in the Gemara than the one that we have, as obscure as this new girsa is. And number two, based on this new girsa, we're going to show how the Rambam himself elsewhere explicitly, black on white, applies mitzvah bo ba'aver to a lulav shel Asherah. Kevan shekain af im bitla psula. Why? Mishum denasta ba'aver. I mean, I would like you to underline those three words, because those three words are the exact opposite of the Tosfos that we spent a lot of time yesterday learning. Tosfos says the fact that nasta ba'aver doesn't generate the psul of mitzvah ba'aver. It's got to be that the avera was responsible for the mitzvah, and if not for the avera, like for example Gezel, he could not have possibly fulfilled the mitzvah. That's not true in the case of Asherah. So the Rambam has a new definition against Tosfos of mitzvah ba'aver, and that should nevda ba'aver. So any object on the face of the earth, and of course it'll be very relevant to a lulav, that was used for an avera, now comes under a psul mitzvah of mitzvah bo ba'aver. The object becomes like a balmum because an avera was done to it. and you can't use it for a mitzvah. Don't try to use for a mitzvah a physical object that was used for an avera. It just doesn't mesh. You can't take an averidik hefta and use it for a mitzvah. You'd be dancing a beta chasidus. You'd be simultaneously dancing in two different ways. Kol shenasa ba aver. In the hefta itself, the aver was done in the Asherah. We olam shayach be psula the mitzvah ba aver. But now we're going to be in deep trouble because Rava says that if you took a lulav shel avodah zara, then b'di'eved you're yotzei. According to this, it's mitzvah ba aver. We don't begin to understand the difference between Asherah and a lulav shel avodah zara. The Rambam here is talking about an Asherah. Okay, now where do we find a source for this other girsa that substitutes mitzvah ba aver for ketuse mechta shiura? So I'm looking for this for a second. I'm not finding it right away. Just give me a second. Oh, can you fast forward to the left column on this? Did the page numbers come out? Shake your head if it's yes. I'm looking for a page that says Chav Zion on it, which is page 2 of 3 pages I sent you. Do you see on the left column Vav?
Yeah.
So fast forward to line 3 in that paragraph Vav, and he quotes verbatim the Rambam and Pirush HaMishnayos. Just a historical note here on the side. How old was the Rambam when he authored the Pirush HaMishnayos? He was 30 years old. How old was the Rambam when he penned the Mishnah Torah, the Yad HaChazaka? 60 years old. So 3 decades passed. So we're now turning the clock back 3 decades to the Rambam's youth. And the Rambam writes, mitzvah ba avera eina mitzvah. Ulefichach, what psul, what scenarios will come under the psul of mitzvah ba avera? Lulav hagazel, fine. V'shel Asherah, v'shel ira nidachas. Possible. I mean, you can't get more explicit than that. So if you ask the kasha on the Maggid Mishnah, what kind of chutzpah noira is it to say that the Rambam had a different girsa? And according to the Rambam's girsa, lulav shel Asher was disqualified not because of ketusim et b'shur, but because of mitzvah bavera. It's black and white in the Rambam and Pirush HaMishnayos. Now that doesn't prove that the Rambam and Mishnah Torah of 30 years later meant the same thing, but you can't fault the Maggid Mishnah for creating something in the Rambam that doesn't exist. The Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos certainly, explicitly classifies Asherah as mitzvah ba aver. Period. You want to argue that the Rambam changed his mind within the 30-year period between Pirush HaMishnayos and the Mishnah Torah? Fine, you can argue that, but you can't call me a liar if I tell you that the Rambam holds, or at least at one point in his life he held, that the psul of Asherah is mitzvah ba aver. That's explicit in the Rambam and Pirush HaMishnayos. Now, where is this other girsa? So I'm trying to find this. Okay. Let's see if we can find this. Anybody see it? I know it's here somewhere, but I don't know. So let me take out the Maggid Mishnah. Maybe he quotes it. Second. Perek Ches Halacha Aleph. He writes here in the Maggid Mishnah, Nirali, he's referring to the Rambam, Shu Gores Kan Mishum Mitzvah Baba Avera, Kiktsas Nuschos. Okay, he adds these two words, Kiktsas Nuschos. The case of Mishnah is humongous. I don't know. I'm gonna. Oh, he writes. Maybe this line will help us. I don't know. He writes it. Divrei Arav HaMagid Khan. This is the case of Mishnah, critiquing the Magid Mishnah. Einom nechonim v'einai. Shekosav sheRabbeinu gores girsach cheres she'eno b'nuschotenu. Okay. So I still haven't found what I'm looking for, but maybe as we go through this piece, I'll find it. Okay, then. So again, so what do we have so far? We have a Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos that Asherah is possible midin mitzvah b'avera. We have a Maggid Mishnah who says that that was the Girsa of the Rambam, not like our Girsa. Now let's go back to number Hey, which is on the right side of your page, the same page, Chaf Zayin. HaKesav Mishnah Hiksha, the Muchach de Lesalach Girsa, Shekosav Maggid Mishnah. The Kesav Mishnah is going to prove that there is no such other Girsa, it just doesn't exist. I don't know what he's going to do with the Rambam Pirush HaMishnayos. Shari Kosu HaMefarshim, Ahid Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan is the one who brought Rav Shimon Bar Yochai of Mitzvah Bava Avera. The Chol Shenikne B'Tchila below Siyua de Mitzvah Ein Bo Mishum Mitzvah Bava Avera. So now the Kesef Mishnah is quoting this Tosfos Hakanya B'Yeush on the bottom of Daf Lamed Amud Aleph, and Tosfos says that Mitzvah Bava Avera only applies if Yesh B'Thi Lo Kani. You need Yeush and Shini Hashem, and when he designates it for the mitzvah of Lulav, then he achieves the Shini Hashem, and he makes the Kinyan. So the Gzela, the Averis Gzela, is completed through the mitzvah. That's Mitzvah Bava Avera. And therefore, Tosfos says the Isa the Yesh Kedi Kani is Sulo Chashiv Mitzvah Bava Avera, because Yeshin alone would be enough to complete the Avera. Oh, so Tosfos talks about the case of a behema. He stole a behema, and he Yesh B'Kdi Lo Kani, so he wasn't kona the behema through Yesh. Val Yidei Hekdesham Kokanili. So when he's magdish the stolen animal, at that point the Gazlan generates the Shini Hashem through the Hegdesh, and that completes the Gzela. The Oz Choshev Mitzvah Bava Avera. So that's what we discussed yesterday, a linkage between the Avera and the mitzvah. It's the mitzvah itself that completes the Avera. Okay then, so that's what we have. And that's how the Kesef Mishnah is operating. So it's very fascinating. The Kesef Mishnah is using the logic and the definition of Tosfos to attack the Maggid Mishnah's interpretation of the Rambam. I mean, that's not really fair play. Well, Pasal Rabbi Yochanan, meaning Mitzvah Bava Avera, Ela Heicha Shelo Kono Adayin, and his kinyan is through the Kriya Hashem Hegdesh, which is the Shini Hashem. Oshekano El Sham Mitzvah B'Sayas B'Kinyan. Oh, so first he says Lo Kano Adayin, which means that Yesh B'Thi Lo Kani. And now he's operating without Shini Hashem. Oshekano El Sham Mitzvah B'Sayas B'Kinyan. That's the Shini Hashem. V'kein Gabi Asherah Delek L'Meimer B'Hachi Shavera Hi B'Niti Asa Le'Akum. That's interesting. when he plants the tree for the sake of avodah zarah, that's the avera. Ein a mitzvah, the netilas lulav, misayas basiyosel klum. It has no impact on the avera whatsoever. So the mitzvah is completely independent and not related to the avera. Therefore, people read lo mifsal el vadai, less lula also gives. So we want to underline in the Kesef Mishnah 3 words, and he says Shan mitzvah misayas bekin, which is about 5 lines up before the end of that paragraph. He summarizes this in the next paragraph. Kesef Mishnah hikshal magid Mishnah mikol divrei atosis divrei mastil ha kanya. Correct? That's the tosis on the bottom of Daf Lam. Right? I'm just double checking. Hakan, right. Shechichu the lekab psul the mitzvah ba'verlan came also a berav mitzvah ke'echad. The dov is a lekab ashera. The ayin the orchlan ner. Shehik shal arama mikoch divrei atosis dimastel bishum. Shechichu the lekab psul the mitzvah ba'verlan came he efshal lekaimis a mitzvah. To get access to the lulav for the mitzvah, he had to steal it. He didn't have another lulav. Shalonase saver, below shanase saver. You go korban agazel or matzahs teva. By matzahs teva, we said it was a little bit more complicated, but it's impossible to eat the matzah for the mitzvah without violating the iser of achilas teva. That's again this kind of efshar lekayim as a mitzvah below aver. So based on all the logical principles of Tosfos and his limitation, Tosfos' limitation of mitzvah b'avera, Asherah is out. Cannot come under mitzvah b'avera. The law yidei avera makaymis ad mitzvah. K'moshkosav Tosfos kan. So now we get to Vav. The Orchaner quotes the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnah as we saw earlier. Lehedju the Posel Ram Lu Shal Shevish Mitzvah B'Avera. Kosav Od Orchaner Umasha Heshiv HaKesef Mishnah. The Zelo Mikri Mitzvah B'Avera. Kosher Kosav HaTosus. Came into law Yidei Avera Mekayim Mitzvah. Eno Kushal Rambam. It's not fair to quote a Tosfos and Tosfos' definition of mitzvah b'avera and ask that as a kash on the Rambam. Sharia Tosfos lo chichukein yakmi mad paslinon mikoach kitusim ech shiura v'lo mitam mitzvah b'avera. The whole emphasis of Tosfos is because in his gears of the Gemara disqualified Asherah because of kitusim ech shiura, not because of mitzvah b'avera. That's what forced Tosfos is back against the wall to reinterpret mitzvah b'avera. It's not just the fact that this hefta was used for an avera, therefore it's possible for mitzvah, but it's because this hefta of avera is what set up the mitzvah, made it possible to do the mitzvah. So to ask that as a kasha on the Rambam makes no sense, because the Rambam didn't have that girsa of kedusei meftashir. Umimad machshavinon Asherah delav de Moshe. Right, according to Tosfos and the gears that we have in Asfarim, the reason why the Psul Asherah Lulav is limited to Asherah de Moshe and doesn't apply to Lav de Moshe is because Kitusim Echtashir only applies when there's no bittul in the case of Asherah. The Ram doesn't have that girsa. The Gam lo hichshir ba'asherah, the lav de Moshe. By Tosfos based on that girsa, is machshir a lulav that was worshipped if it wasn't shel Moshe, but rather it was shel Akum, and it lends itself to bittul. So basically, I mean, to summarize this last paragraph of the Aruch LaNer, the Rambam is not operating with Ketusei Mechta Shira. So don't ask me all the kashas based on the definitions of Mitzvah Bava Vera of Tosfos, which are all based on the girsa of Ketusei Mechta Shira. The Rambam doesn't have that girsa. Therefore, he doesn't have those restrictions and limitations of Mitzvah Bava Vera. And the Rambam is going to apply Mitzvah Bava Vera if nevda, if nasta ba'avera, even after bittul, because that's mitzvah ba'avera according to the Rambam. The Shitas Rambam, there are also mitzvah b'isuri anah chashiv nena b'isuri anah. Now we have a new shita of the Aruch LaNer and the Rambam that by doing the mitzvah you benefit from the object. You get a hana from the mitzvah itself. And now we're talking about Isuri hana. Anything that was worshipped is now Asur hana. Midim, Hachrim, Tachrim, and so forth. I mean, mitzvah b'avera could go on Ochel Matzas Teva. In other words, by definition, when you use this lulav of Avodah Zarah for the mitzvah of lulav, then you violate the Isur Hana. So there's always going to be a violation of the Isur Hana through the mitzvah. And that's exactly like Matzah Shel Teva, where anytime you want to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Matzah, namely Achilas HaMatzah, you violate the Isur Teva. Here too, anytime you want to use the Lulav Shel Avodah Zarah, you violate the Isur Hana of Avodah Zarah. And that makes into mitzvah b'avera. So the Amudei Hod, in the next paragraph, asks the following question, raises the following objection against the Aruch LaNer. We could have said this on our own. It's obvious. Lefi Dvarav, according to the Aruch LaNer's interpretation of the Rambam, Gam Lulav Shel Avodah Zarah Pasuk. We should apply Mitzvah B'avera to a Lulav Shel Avodah Zarah because it's also Hana, and the mitzvah itself is Hana. And the Rambam, in the same halacha that we're learning, writes that he codifies the halacha of Rava. It's explicit that the Rambam holds the lulav shel avodah zarah. You could be yotzi yidei chovasa. V'lo chilek bein kodem bittul bein liachar bittul. V'chein lo chilek bein Yisrael bein akum. Mashma de B'kol Gavni. Now we're going to turn to Chav Ches, which I think is your page 3. Yotza Yidei Chovaso, Umayshno Mishal Asher, Arei Nevde Ba'avera. V'yasa Rubana, so whichever definition you take in the Rambam, Mitzvah Ba'avera, it applies equally to an Avodah Zarah of what? Of Ben Yisrael, Ben Shalachu. Now we're up to number 9, the Nir alone. So this, my friend, is as far as I got. From now on, we're learning this together b'chavrusa. V'hinei kushas hakesed mishal Rambam lama v'shal ashera v'mitzvah b'avera ein avera v'mitzvah nasis kechad. Yeshli Yashiv, the Rambam Sfirle Kishitas Rabbeinu Tam. Okay, now the Mechaber is introducing another source, which is not here in Masechet Sukka. We had no access to it. We had no knowledge of it. It's a Rabbeinu Tam quoted in 2 different Masechtas in Shas, but they're not Masechet Sukka. They're in Bava Kama and Gittin. The spirale Rabbeinu Tam holds the af im kodma haver mitzvah. Let's say you hold yesh b'chli kani, and therefore with yesh the avera of gezela is complete. Nevertheless, Rabbeinu Tam says it's possible a mitzvah midin mitzvah b'av avera. Gam kein possible mishum. V'chein meduyik mipirish Rashi b'sugyasein shepirish es divrei haGemara b'kra Pesach v'gozel mayri liachar yeyush. I'm sorry, Pisach v'gozel. I read that wrong. So that's Malachi. Is Pisach v'gozel is liachar yeyush. L'mad yom yeyush kidi. Kani. We call it ikab psula mishum mitzvah b'av aver. The aver was complete before the mitzvah. And Rabbeinu Tam refuses to accept that limitation, that restriction of Tosfos, that mitzvah b'av avera only applies when you connect the avera with the mitzvah. There's got to be that sirut. Rabbeinu Tam says no. If the avera was done in the object, i.e., he stole the object, even though the mitzvah of lulav has nothing whatsoever to do with the stealing, nevertheless, it's mitzvah b'av avera. But again, I'm not sure what Rabbeinu Tam means by that. It could be Rabbeinu Tam means by that since he could not have had access to the lulav without stealing it, therefore it's mitzvah b'av avera. So far, I have to admit, I'm on the fence here as a spectator, and I'm not satisfied with this. But I feel in my bones he's gonna have to raise this question that I raised. It doesn't seem to be a valid analogy between a stolen lulav and a lulav that was worshipped as an asherah. So what I'm going to do with your reshus is I'm going to take a little bit of a break here. I'm just going to skim the next few paragraphs here with my eyes and see if he raises our point. Okay, they say I'm going under now. I'm doing what's it called? Where's Jeff? Scuba diving, right? Okay. Wow, I'm impressed. I'm very, very excited, guys. Now I have to inspire you with the same simcha that I have. Wow, this next paragraph, the Kushas Harach Lamed. Beautiful. Listen to this. He quotes the Maggid Mishnah. Again, I have the Maggid Mishnah opened here on the couch. Maybe we'll find it. But for the meantime, if you don't mind, we'll rely on a secondary source. He says, V'tam ha'ashera. Why is it that Asherah, according to the Rambam, is disqualified under the category of mitzvah b'av avera? She'ikar nitiyasa lios ha'ila nevad. Wow, this is mind-boggling. Why did they plant the tree? You and I could give many reasons why you planted a tree. Here, on the other side of this door behind me, there are no trees, which is a problem. I'm living now in a neighborhood which is relatively new, 4 years old, and the streets are not lined with trees. Now, why should that bother me? I could always take a little walk down the road to the next neighborhood. It's called Tamar, and there are plenty of trees there. But the answer is, if there are no trees, don't wear a hat. The wind just blows away your hat. This is true. This is not dramatization. They warned me about the winter here. So people wear, like baseball caps and so forth. You can't wear yarmulke here in this neighborhood. Even last night, I almost had my hat blown off on the way back from Myra. Maybe that's why they don't wear hats here in Efrat. I don't know. By the way, I'm known as the only person in the city of Efrat who wears a tie and a jacket. Anybody who sees me wearing a tie and jacket, oh, that's Rabbi Berzon. They know already. The word is out. So I don't know what's going to be a month from now. At some point, maybe I'm going to stop wearing a hat and a jacket and a tie. I think I told you about, so my father would not go out to mail a letter. Remember the old days when they had the mailboxes at the corner? It was like a couple hundred yards from the house. He wouldn't go out without his tie. I said, Dad, you don't need a tie to put the garbage into the waste paper. He says, for me, without a tie, I feel naked. That's my father told me. In any event, getting back to Asherah, why do you plant a tree? To write a whole, like Shakespeare would write a whole book about it, to be or not to be a tree, right? This tree, which is called an Asherah tree, was planted for one reason and for one purpose only, to be worshipped as an idol, as a deity. That's why they planted it. If not for Avodah Zarah, if not for paganistic culture and motives, they would not have planted the tree. Nitiasa bi'ikara lios ilon hanevad. What justified the planting of this tree in their minds? They weren't looking for shade. They weren't looking for fruits on the tree or to block the winds here on the mountains. They planted it specifically for Avodah Zarah. V'zeh pirish Asherah de Moshe. Okay, now he casts a whole new light on this phrase Asherah de Moshe. Ratzalomar shehizkir Moshe. Okay, I don't know what that means. V'chein kasev Rabbeinu Sham. He refers to the Rambam Hilchas Akum Perches Halacha Gimel. Oh, we should open up that Rambam. Elon shenetod mitchila. This is the language of the Rambam in Perek Gimel, in Perches Milchas Akum Halacha Gimel. Elon shenetod mitchila she'hei nevad. It was planted from the get-go for the purpose of worship. Osur bana. Vizui Asherah Hamura B'Torah. So I guess the word Torah here is a substitute for Moshe, right? Because Moshe, or shall we say it the other way around, Moshe is a substitute for Torah. Asherah the Moshe means the Asherah of the Torah. When the Torah speaks about destroying the Asherah, right? Tisrafu Ba'esh, it's referring to a tree that was planted for the purpose of Neva. So now, based on this quote of the Maggid Mishnah, we understand very well, Kevan shenetias ha'ilon mitchila hoisa lios nevad bidinu sheyiposel. Oh, this is part of the Maggid Mishnah, sorry. Bidinu sheyiposel, and we have to add a few words here. Bidin mitzvah b'avera. Masha enke bi'aku, zeu das rabin. In other words, you have a tree, and a guy comes along and worships the tree. The Rambam would say that the lulav of that tree is kosher, at least b'di'evet. Why? because it wasn't planted from the get-go for the purpose of being a nevad. It's not an Asherah Demoshe, which means an Asherah Shel Torah. And the Asherah Shel Torah that requires Sreifa is the Asherah, says the Rambam in Hilchos Akum, that was planted for the purpose of Avodah. So in the next paragraph, Mavur B'divrei HaMagid Mishnah, the Rambam, Sfirle, the Rambam, the Garcina, the Gemara, the Asherah, the Masnisa Meir B'Asherah Demoshe Ella, Shapir Sharam the Asherah Demoshe Asherah Amura B'Torah, Perusha Shenita Mitchilasa L'Shem Avodah Zarah. Ulefi Zeh, the next paragraph, the Asherah Miskayim Hach Klola Shekosu Atosvis. You remember yesterday, I was pressing you on this, that the Tosfos says that what's mitzvah b'avera? That machmas ha-mitzvah b'avera. Right? Let's go back to the Tosfos, just double check. I'm sorry, I messed up. The machmas ha-vera Ba mitzvah. The Avera is the Av, and the mitzvah is the Tol. It's the Avera that gives birth to the mitzvah. Without the Avera, there would be no mitzvah. And that applies beautifully to an Asherah. Why? She efshal l'kayim es ha-mitzvah below l'fgor ba'avera kegon ochel matzas teva. How does this apply to Asherah Demoshe? Sharei b'Asherah Demoshe shenitar l'shem avodah zarah. He would not have planted it if not for avodah zarah. Nimtza shekol mitzias halulav. How is this lulav given birth to? I don't know. Did I mention to you that my daughter-in-law gave birth yesterday? First girl after 7 boys. Nobody in our family believes it. Thank you. A girl after 7 boys. Last time my daughter-in-law was pregnant, I was in Chutz La'aretz. So Binyamin, my son, says to me, Abba, I know you won't be here on time, so I want to notify you of the gender of the child. And I actually missed the bris because I was in Chutz La'aretz. So I said to my son, you don't have to notify me of the gender. I know the gender of the child. He already had 6 boys. I knew the 7th was going to be a boy. But my wife suspected in this pregnancy, I don't know how, maybe she has Ruach HaKodesh, that it's going to be a girl. I said, come on. After 7 boys? Anyway, she gave back to a girl. Very cute little girl. No one's going to start up with her. She has 7 brothers to protect her. Anyway, Nimtza Shekol Mitzias Halulav Ba Mikoach Averas Avodah Zarah, because he was interested in serving Avodah Zarah, in this case the Asherah, that's why he planted the Asherah. So it's the Avera that gives birth to the mitzvah. And that's why it's mitzvah above there. Shapim Mikri mitzvah above Avera. Mikoach Avera, Machmas Avera. Mashen came lulav shel Avodah Zarah, like we said before, somebody comes along and worships a lulav. He didn't plant it from Avodah Zarah. V'ena mitzvah ba mikoach avera al kein yotzi yedei chovaso b'di'eved delekebe psula the mitzvah ba avera. It has no psul of mitzvah ba avera. Ooh, I didn't realize how late it was. Okay, then. So we'll stop here, and immediately, B'li Neder, we're going to go into our next shir, which is shofar. Okay, then. Have a great day. Thank you.